You don't, or the dairy, you don't ask to look at all the packs. I think you go in and say, I'm after a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah. And
whatever they are.
The brand name.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Like, I've always been a non-smoker, but having said that, I've seen those packets overseas and they're repulsive. So I can see it in particular, going back to our pre-5 o'clock discussion on disgustedness, I can see it actually having an impact on young women who really don't want to see those gross photos that they put on the packets.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's very hard to tell because data is quoted from both sides in this debate, and plain packaging came in Australia 5 years ago, and there's data online from the Australian Secondary Students Alcohol and Drug Survey. There's all sorts of data, but this one suggests teen smoking numbers dropped a percentage point a year basically, and adult rates also fell. On the other hand, an opinion piece in Forbes magazine says the policy's been a disaster. You don't always know who sponsors research in this area, but Professor Sinclair Davidson of RMIT University in Melbourne is saying this, for example.
In actual fact, there are more people smoking in Australia today than what there were 5 years ago when the policy was introduced. If at first, if you don't succeed, then you should either change the rules or cheat. And the government has changed the rules and cheated.
So he says the claim there's been a 3.4% decline in tax excise is untrue, and there's been a 4.5% increase. He reckons data mining is rife and misleading, and the plain packaging effect is zip. So who's to know?
Well, who is to know? I sort of feel like he might be getting backhanders from
oh, shouldn't say that, Victoria.
Industry.
I'm sure that's not true.
No, I was jesting. But, you know, I think you need to look at cause and effect. Like, his argument is it got introduced, there's been an increase, therefore it doesn't work. But actually, aren't we better to say there's been an increase? Why? Because it may be something completely unrelated to the packaging. It just seems too sort of simple to make the statements that he's made.
Well, I suppose we'll find out as time goes by in New Zealand. So that'll start tomorrow. Parliament's to get a playground. Oh, sorry, did you want to add something on that, John?
No, that's fine.
Parliament's to get a playground. There'll be a space made available on the lawn in front of the Beehive. Trevor Mallard says Parliament's a place for everyone. Do you feel Parliament is a place for you?
Look, well done, Parliament. I'm sure that it's got something to do with the Prime Minister, but I'm not suggesting she has pushed for it, but I don't think they'd have thought about it before. And I don't think there'll be a lot of kids playing in that playground.
No, but
sorry.
No, you go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it. I just feel like it's going to be a space for middle-class children. You know, come on, our money can be better spent on, you know, more important things than that.
I agree. It's outside. So, you know, Wellington in the winter, there aren't going to be too many kids on that.
What are you saying about our weather?
Inclement.
First we're impugning the lawyers and then we're impugning the weather.
Our roundabouts go very fast.
I was going to ask you about Qantas. Do I have time? We noted a few weeks back that Qantas had been told by the Chinese to stop referring to Taiwan as a destination separate from China, and Qantas went away to think about that, and it's had a think, and it now plans to change its website to refer to Taiwan as a Chinese territory.
It's the old golden rule. He who has the gold rules. And China said, you know, I think it's really bad, but, you know.
Okay.
Agree.
All right, thank you both panellists. Victoria Stewart, always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
And John, always nice to see you. John Barnett.
And you, thank you.
We're back tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Checkpoint now.
Kia ora, good evening. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly in for John Campbell. Tonight on Checkpoint, more than 200 millimetres of rain in 24 hours, combined with forestry debris, brings chaos to Tolaga Bay, destroying homes, bridges and blocking roads. And as the clean-up begins, locals call for better management of slash left by loggers. Also tonight, former National Prime Minister Jim Bolger will lead a government working group looking at setting up sector-wide collective negotiations. We ask if the privacy of a Housing New Zealand tenant was breached after he sought help for his drug and alcohol addiction. Could a genetic test for breast cancer patients be the key to avoiding unnecessary chemotherapy? All that after 5 o'clock.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Bat and aho. A Tolaga Bay forestry company says it's puzzled by how much debris was washed away by flash flooding yesterday morning. Local residents say they've been warning for years about the mismanagement of forestry slash and say they're lucky to have escaped unharmed as a torrent of debris swept through properties and clogged up rivers and roads. The Gisborne District Council says it will investigate whether any of the companies are in breach of their resource consent. Some of the debris came from the Hikarangi Forest Farms, and its General Manager, Ian Brown, says the amount is beyond precedent.
We're not quite sure where this has come from or how it's been mobilised. And just the bit that we've seen is it seems to be very old logs which could have been around for a number of years.
Ian Brown from Hikarangi Forest Farms. A new online petition calling for stricter controls on logging companies to protect soil from erosion and waterways from slash has attracted nearly 1,000 signatures. The government has set up a working group to make recommendations on the design of a new industry-wide collective bargaining system. It'll be led by the former National Party Prime Minister, Jim Bolger. The Workplace Relations Minister, Ian Galloway, says fair pay agreements will be struck between unions and employers, setting minimum terms and conditions of employment for all workers in an entire industry or occupation. He says, unlike existing collective bargaining, strikes and lockouts will not be permitted in negotiations for a fair pay agreement.
There was some concern that if you have a form of industry-wide bargaining, that you could see industry-wide industrial action. I don't think that's in anybody's best interests.
Ian Galloway expects the group to report back to him by the end of this year. The Ministry for the Environment will be monitoring a pledge by the major supermarket chains to reduce their packaging waste. New World, Pack and Save and Countdown supermarkets today joined local and international companies including Coca-Cola, Unilever and L'Oreal in pledging to make all their packaging recyclable or compostable in 7 years. The Associate Environment Minister, Eugenie Sage, says the pledge signals a change in the corporation's attitudes towards waste.
It's showing that they are going to make an effort, and I think the public will call them to account on that. And it's companies also reporting to MFE annually on their progress, so there will be some monitoring.
Eugenie Sage. The Prime Minister will formally hand over to her deputy, Winston Peters, once she arrives at hospital to give birth. Jacinda Ardern's office has released details about her public plans once the baby is born. The due date is June the 17th. If she's in Auckland, Ms Ardern will go to Auckland Hospital, but there are contingency plans if she's elsewhere. She's already said she'll work up until she goes into labour. Parliament resumes sitting next week for a 4-week session. The government was warned the only upside to a future ban on exploration for oil and gas would be investor certainty, balanced against several other risks. Cabinet briefing papers and official communications about the decision to halt future offshore exploration permits have been released. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The papers detail risks such as higher gas prices, energy supply security and a detrimental impact on some regional economies. And they say global greenhouse gas emissions could rise if a restricted supply of natural gas pushes up prices, slowing local methanol production to be replaced with methanol made from coal in China. The Energy and Resources Minister Megan Woods says all of that was taken into account and existing permits will all be honoured, while the government works on the transition to renewables. But National says the papers reveal a horror show of a process for such an important decision. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
The death toll from the Fuego volcano eruption in Guatemala has risen to 65. It sent a massive ash plume into the sky and tons of rocks, ash and mud cascading down the mountain. The country's president, Jimmy Morales, has travelled to the area and has been meeting with locals. It's the volcano's most violent eruption in more than a century, and the death toll is expected to rise. An Auckland painter who stopped a homicide on Queen Street is being honoured this afternoon at Government House for his bravery. The Governor-General is presenting 10 New Zealanders with Royal Humane Society silver medals. Zane Parkey was working at the AWI International Education Group building in May 2015 when a man stabbed his partner to death, then turned on her friend. Mr Parkey says he didn't know a woman had already been killed when he took the knife off the attacker.
When I took the knife off him and he turned around and faced me, she was on the ground dead, And then I went, my heart just went, I was like, it's just gone from attempted murder to a murder and attempted murder, you know. If I would have seen that first, I probably would have did it differently. I probably would have just picked up my ladder and just smacked them on the head and then just knocked them out.
Zane Parkey, who's receiving an award today from the Royal Humane Society. It's 5:05. Sport. Despite having missed the Crusaders' last couple of Super Rugby matches due to concussion, midfielder Ryan Crotty is confident he's up to Test match standard. Crotty has been concussed twice this year and twice last year, but says he monitors his recovery carefully and has his brain function tested every year to ensure there's no long-term mental damage. The All Blacks play their first test of the year against France in Auckland on Saturday night. And Crotty says although he hasn't played for a few weeks, he won't be taking a conservative approach.
You know when you're right. I guess that's probably the best way I can explain it. You know when you're not feeling right, and that's probably the alarming thing. But then once you do feel right again, then you gradually increase your training load until you're back to where we were before.
Ryan Crotty. A hole-in-one has helped Manawatu golfer Tim Wilkinson to qualify for next week's US Open. Wilkinson, who lost his PGA Tour card for this season, finished second at a qualifying tournament in Washington, with the highlight being a spectacular hole-in-one during his second round. It's the second time in 3 years that Wilkinson has qualified for the US Open, and he joins Aucklander Ryan Fox, who's also made the final field after a strong performance at a qualifying tournament in England. The US Open tees off on Thursday week at the Shinnecock Hills course in New York. That's the news.
Eruption in Guatemala.
Really fast-flowing lava flow that just came pouring out of the top of the volcano, tumbling down the side and destroying whole villages.
Floods on the east coast.
I was quite shocked at how swift the water was sort of, almost waist deep and very, very hard to stand up on it.
But no landslides in the latest polls.
The Greens slipping back and New Zealand First slipping back, but nonetheless, Labour and the Greens with this poll would still have enough support to form a government.
Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy Espin, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, how Transpower's preparing for major changes in the energy sector, from growing demand for renewable sources to more households going off-grid. And after 10, illustrator and environmentalist Giselle Clarkson on her new collaboration and her passion for adventure. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, occasional showers, some heavy from tomorrow afternoon with possible thunderstorms and hail. Waikato to Kapiti, including the central high country, mostly fine today. Showers tomorrow with some heavy with hail and snow to 600 metres about the central high country. Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Scattered rain clearing today. Showers from tomorrow afternoon, some heavy with hail and snow to 600 metres about Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Wellington and Wairarapa, isolated showers today. Showers becoming widespread tomorrow with hail and snow above 600 metres. To Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine apart from a few showers tonight or early tomorrow. Marlborough and Canterbury, cold southerlies developing tonight with showers. Snow to 200 metres tomorrow morning, then easing later. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, occasional rain or showers with possible thunderstorms about the south coast today. Snow to 200 metres tonight and tomorrow morning. The Chatham Islands, a period of heavy rain and thunderstorms tonight, then showers tomorrow. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Good evening, welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly in for John Campbell. Tonight, a big clean-up is underway in Tolaga Bay on the east coast after flash flooding early yesterday morning left many homes, farms and beaches littered with logs and silt. Local residents say they've been raising concerns for years about the management of forestry debris, known as slash, left by loggers. They say they're lucky to have escaped unharmed after a river of forestry logs blasted through their properties. And the Gisborne District Council says it will be investigating. Our Te Manu Kōrehi reporter John Boynton is in Tolaga Bay and filed this report.
In the dark morning hours, Linda Goff and her husband Vernon were awoken by what they thought was the sound of a power transformer exploding.
We woke up because the power went off at about 3:30, 4 in the morning. Then we kept hearing like explosions and then we had the dogs started really going crazy.
And when they could finally see, they were surrounded by a torrent of floodwater and debris.
But what it's done, it's gone through the bottom of the barn and just smashed everything. Like we haven't got power because we have a big generator and that's just been silted right through, so we can't even turn that on, which we normally do when we lose power.
Their Pārua Road property inland of Tolaga Bay now lies in logs, trees and other debris, which has turned a gentle river next to their home into a cavernous valley. Linda Goff says the recent intensification of forestry is where the root of the problem lies.
This would not have happened if these logs were not left to be washed down into our rivers. That happens constantly with the beaches. It's ruining the whole area.
This is the third time the Goff's property has flooded, and they say they can't get insurance cover for it. Vernon Goff sums up the last couple of days in one word.
Nightmarish, really. Just, waking up this morning, it's like, it's not a dream, it's again, and it's like, oh, what can you do? Really, what can you do? You've just got to make the best of it.
He's heard it's only going to become more intensive. But before that happens, he wants the Gisborne District Council to enforce the local forestry industry to properly dispose of off material and logs. Back in Tolaga Bay, Blair Timmins says logs were flying past houses on the banks of the Uawa River yesterday. Many locals describe the normally pristine waters at Tolaga being turned into a sea of black debris.
The river was in a raging torrent, big logs coming down through the river. It started bursting the banks across the road from us, and when you went down to the sea there in front of Tolaga, it actually looked like an island full of logs, debris.
And he's surprised at how much damage inland was caused by the torrent of logs.
I mean, it rained in Tolaga, but they must have had a lot of rain up in the hills, and it just all come down from up there, and yeah, it's done that much damage. It's unbelievable.
One farmer, Dean Bresnell, says locals have been raising concerns for years about the debris and have spent about 5 years petitioning the council for stricter rules on its management.
There has been meetings and huis here in Uawa regarding issues the community have raised about the amount of wood. So yeah, it's definitely been an ongoing thing, and not just here in Uawa, and lots of parts of Gisborne and the coast especially. It's definitely been raised with the council prior to this.
Environmental Services Director at Gisborne District Council, Nick Salmon, says the debris comes from 2 logging companies and the council will be investigating.
We've had over 266 millimetres of rain in a 24-hour period. So there have been landslips, but there also might have been practices in terms of what forestry companies have been doing, and we'll be investigating to see what the actual causes are. It is very much likely to be a combination of both.
A local logging company, Hikurangi Forest Farms, is one of the farms that will be investigated. Its general manager, Ian Brown, says he's puzzled at how much debris there is.
Looking at the amount of slash that's involved in this particular instance, it's beyond precedent. So we're not quite sure where this has come from or how it's been mobilised. And just the bit that we've seen is it seems to be very old logs which could have been around for a number of years.
An online petition calling for stricter controls on logging companies to protect soil from erosion and waterways from slash, set up last night by locals, has attracted nearly 1,000 signatures. In Tolaga Bay, mo te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko John Boynton aho.
And we'll hear more about the forestry debris when we speak with the Environmental Services Director at the Gisborne District Council, Nick Salmon, after 6 o'clock tonight. But a short time ago, I spoke with Met Service meteorologist Georgina Griffiths and asked her if Tolaga Bay had seen the end of the bad weather.
Yes, mostly. Pretty much. Nearly all gone. Mm-hmm.
What about the rest of the country?
Oh, now we're about to change track very strongly with the strong cold southerly coming up, pushing up the country. It's affecting the far south of the country already. And as that moves through Christchurch tonight, and across the remainder of the North Island tomorrow. First of all, we're going to feel very cold. That strong to gale southerly has got bite on the temperatures and the wind chill will be very poor. However, the most important thing, I think, for people who are trying to travel tomorrow is the amount of snow we're expecting. We'll talk some details in a minute, and the fact that we have road snow warnings in force for all of the usual South Island roads and some of the North Island ones too. So really, there's a heavy snow watch in place for Fiordland, Southland and Otago. We expect snow to 200 metres overnight, down in places like Otago, Southland. And so the hill suburbs of Dunedin, for example, might see some flurries. We've actually got a road snow and force for Dunedin to Waitati, State Highway 1, with a couple of centimetres on top of the summit accumulation overnight. So that's a transport issue. And of course we've got road snow warnings with more significant accumulations in place for Lewis, Arthurs, Porters and Lindis passes, also the Crown Range Road overnight and into tomorrow morning, 4 to 6 centimetres at the top of the road for the Crown Range. Also got a couple of centimetres on the Rimataka Hill Road tomorrow morning and afternoon. So it's really Wednesday problem or afternoon for the North Island where we had that southerly causing some problems on the Rimataka Hill Road. And Napier Taupo Road tomorrow afternoon and evening should accumulate 2 to 5 centimetres at the top. And the Desert Road, quite a significant road snow of 4 to 6 centimetres at the summit. So everywhere on those high elevation roads of New Zealand in the next 24 hours, see some snow on the road. So that's really important for people who are trying to travel to remember. And also significant accumulations above about 400 metres in the inland South Island, including Canterbury, Banks Peninsula, and of course Fiordland South and Otago.
And how long is that cold blast going to last for?
Well, the snow more or less eases off in the south by about lunchtime, depending on where you are, and in Wednesday evening, tomorrow evening for the North Island, more or less. The showers in the southerlies continue into Thursday, that cold breeze, strong cold breeze, but it does start to gradually ease off both showers and wind strength on Thursday. I guess for people who live in sea level, it's not really about the snow, it's also that heavy rain getting into places like Dunedin. It's a heavy rain event at sea level, of course, for places like Dunedin, Oamaru, Timaru and Canterbury, periods of rain from tonight and overnight and first thing in the morning and then easing. And that rain has risk of being heavy. And, if you think about how much rain the eastern areas of both islands have had this year, that they don't want any more. They've simply had enough of the rain. So it's a cold event and a wet one for the eastern areas, of course. So Wellington doesn't look too pretty. But, it's only a watch for snow. It doesn't quite meet warning criteria, and it's more or less gone by Thursday afternoon.
And that's the Met Service meteorologist Georgina Griffiths. The former National Prime Minister Jim Bolger will lead a government working group looking at setting up sector-wide collective negotiations. The plan is to set up fair pay agreements to be struck between unions and employers, setting minimum terms and conditions of employment for all workers in an entire industry or occupation. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
Under Jim Bolger's watch in the 1990s, the Controversial Employment Contracts Act was passed, which saw the end of compulsory unions and the deregulation of employer-employee bargaining. But now it appears he wants to get involved in a new form of collective bargaining.
What we're looking at really is what is fair.
Mr Bolger will lead a 9-person panel made up of representatives from business, unions, academia, hospitality and sport. He says he decided to take part because there's a sense out there that the world is no longer fair.
That some have made obscene wealth and some are missing out just about altogether. We try to look after the bottom by minimum wage rates, but it's the middle that seems to be almost forgotten. And I think what we have to do, and what the panel will try to do, 10 good people, is find some answers in this space.
Fair pay agreements would be industry or sector-wide, like the care and support workers settlement done under the former National-led government. So what's the difference between that kind of agreement and a multi-employer collective agreement? The Minister for Workplace Relations, Ian Lees-Galloway, explains.
Multi-employer collective agreements only involve the specific employers that are involved in the bargaining, whereas this will apply across an occupation or an industry. All employers, it will apply to all employers. It will also apply to all workers, unionised or not.
Ian Lees-Galloway says unlike existing collective bargaining, strikes and lockouts will not be permitted in negotiations for a fair pay agreement. He says there was some concern that if there was a form of industry-wide bargaining, there could be industry-wide industrial action, which would not be in anyone's best interests.
And there are other ways to deal with impasses and disagreements than just industrial action. That remains available for standard collective bargaining, multi-employer collective bargaining. Nothing's changing there. But for these particular agreements, they are They are special. They do represent a significant change in the way we do industrial relations in New Zealand, and we think we can do them without industrial action.
John Milford from Business New Zealand admits the businesses he represents do have some concerns about industry-wide bargaining.
Concerns around flexibility, ensuring that the flexibility is there for businesses to be able to interact with their employees, to make sure that the relationship is still strong there with their own employees in their own business. Cost, of course, cost is a concern. We want to ensure that all businesses can actually afford the outcomes, because if they can't afford the outcomes, then that's not a good thing for business.
John Milford says it's important that what comes out of the working group and the ensuing legislation is something that's supported by the majority of businesses and employees.
So we're going in with some concerns. Having said that, we're pleased to be part of the solution, because we're pleased to be around the table, because if we don't put our concerns there, then we can't stand on the outside and lob sort of hand grenades in.
The President of the Council of Trade Unions, Richard Wagstaff, says he doesn't imagine the agreements would cover sectors where there's already strong collective bargaining.
I doubt that we'll see industry standard agreements for nurses or for teachers or for a whole lot of workers who already have strong collectives. It would seem to me there's a mechanism there that's working. It's more likely to be in those industries where there isn't effective collective bargaining, like the care and support industry.
The working group will cost $300,000, the money coming out of existing Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment funding. The panel's expected to make recommendations to the Minister by the end of the year. Atu i te whare pārimata mō te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Chris Bramalaho. A former State House tenant says he is still paying back Housing New Zealand for a meth test 3 years after his eviction. Jesse Bradley says automatic payments are still being made from his benefit after a tenancy tribunal order ruled low levels of contamination most likely occurred while he was living there. But as Bridget Burke reports, the order also states Housing New Zealand was advised to test Mr Bradley's flat after he sought drug and alcohol treatment, raising questions about patient confidentiality.
A tenancy tribunal order dated June 2015 ordered Jesse Bradley pay Housing New Zealand over $2,200 for a meth test. The ruling says Housing New Zealand was advised by an Auckland DHB to test Jesse's Hobson Street flat for contamination after he sought drug and alcohol treatment. But Jesse says he didn't know this. He denies ever smoking meth there and says none of his friends did either.
Maybe the people that lived there beforehand smoked methamphetamine. Maybe they just tested the walls after I moved out just to make a statement.
Jesse was evicted in March 2015, but Housing New Zealand continued to take rent until May that year, resulting in an overpayment of almost $800. Housing New Zealand deducted the overpayment from the cost of the meth test, leaving Jesse with a debt of $1,400. The meth test itself concluded while his flat was contaminated, there was no need for any remediation or retesting of the property afterwards. Jesse says nobody told him at the time he would be financially liable for the positive meth test.
I had to find out by myself because I tried to buy something on a hire purchase, but they said my credit rating is bad. And I go, why? And they said, because you owe a massive debt to Housing New Zealand. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I wasn't like, oh, okay. I was like, hey, this really sucks. Why have they done this to me?
Jesse says it was upsetting for him to learn last week there were no health risks from meth smoking residue. While he continues to pay for the meth test from his benefit, he has a message for Housing New Zealand.
Clean up your act and maybe help people that need help instead of like pushing everyone around and going by themselves so solo instead of mainstream. And like stop being so secretive and actually come out and open up about what's really going on instead of being like a privatized company, I guess. That's what I call them, a company.
Jesse sought treatment for his addiction from the Waitemata DHB. In a statement, the DHB says it's not the practice of the Community Alcohol and Drug Service to share confidential patient medical information with Housing New Zealand. So what does Housing New Zealand have to say? How did it know to test Jesse's flat for meth in the first place? And why does the Tenancy Tribunal ruling say it was informed by the DHB? It has refused to comment. And the Ministry of Justice's Acting Group Manager for Courts and Tribunals, Richard Williams, says it does not comment on judicial decisions or the evidence provided to judicial officers in hearings. For Checkpoint, Bridget Burke.
Dozens of people remain missing in Guatemala after the country's most violent volcanic eruption in more than a century. At least 65 people are known to have died after superheated rocks, ash and mud from the Fuego volcano erupted and tore down the slopes. The volcano is about 25 kilometres from the capital Guatemala City, from where the BBC's Ali Makbul reports.
As spectacular and dramatic as it was destructive and deadly. In its most violent eruption in decades, the Volcán de Fuego, volcano of fire, exploded in a massive shower of molten rock and ash. The plumes rose several miles into the air. In one village, fascination with what was going on quickly turned to terror as hot ash shot towards onlookers. Fast-moving rivers of burning mud and debris spread chaos. In the panic, family members were split up, children separated from their parents, and many are still missing.
I only managed to find 2 children alive last night. My 2 daughters, grandson, and my son are missing, together with my entire family.
And entire villages were blanketed in a suffocating layer of hot ash. It's clear many stood little chance of getting away. Those who did have been left shell-shocked. Next to bodies of people who died in the village of El Rodeo, an elderly man sits. "Look at the state I'm in," he says. Recovery workers continue to look for survivors or for more bodies, but they do that in the shadow of a volcano that could erupt again at any time.
The challenge we've faced is that the volcano has been active, and also the difficulty of working with this kind of material, which is extremely hot.
Many rescuers reported their shoes melted into the ground as they worked. 3 days of mourning have been declared for all those who've been killed, those whose bodies have been recovered and those who've yet to be found. But all the time there's still this sense, this fear that more is still to come. There have been subsequent explosions and there's even been an earthquake just off Guatemala in recent hours as well. And that's why people are still reeling from that huge major eruption. This was always known to be an active volcano, but an eruption as big as this and that claimed so many lives was beyond living memory. Now a new generation knows the horrors the volcano of fire can bring.
And that was Ali Makbul from Guatemala City. A New Zealand oncologist says funding genetic tests for patients with early-stage breast cancer would provide them with more certainty and clarity about their treatment options. It follows the release of an American study which found about 70% of women in the early stages of breast cancer might be able to skip chemotherapy. Catherine Hutton reports.
Auckland woman Louise Kugler was diagnosed with an early-stage, slow-growing breast cancer in April last year. Based on this, her oncologist recommended a treatment plan that included hormone therapy and radiotherapy, but not chemotherapy. He also mentioned something called a mammoprint, which involves sending samples of her tissue to the United States for testing. Louise and her husband decided to pay $6,000 themselves for the test, which isn't covered by private medical insurance or the public health system. She's pleased they did.
The test came back with a surprisingly different result than what was expected, which was that it was actually a high-risk breast cancer. So based on that information, my oncologist then changed my treatment plan and included chemotherapy alongside the other treatment as well.
The test is used for women who have early-stage breast cancer once they've had surgery to determine the risk of the cancer returning. These women are already on long-term hormone medication, but the study, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looked at whether adding chemo was effective. Currently, women who get a low score on the test are told they don't need chemo, while those with a high score are told they definitely do. But most women get an intermediate result and their treatment plan is less clear. Auckland oncologist Ruben Broom is a medical advisor for the Breast Cancer Foundation and is currently in Chicago at the conference where the study's findings were released. He says the study has focused on a grey area of oncology.
For about 15% of patients who have lymph node negative hormone receptor positive breast cancer in New Zealand, I think that this test would provide a lot of extra clarity and be able to reassure those patients that omitting chemotherapy is the right decision.
Dr Broom says because the test isn't publicly funded in New Zealand, oncologists rely on the data pathologists give them to try and determine how aggressive the cancer is. As a result, most patients here have a treatment plan that is based on a good amount of information that enables doctors to make a sensible decision.
But there will be a smaller but significant number of patients for whom having the extra information with a multi-gene score, such as Oncotype DX or one of the other platforms, will be able to provide certainty that they are not missing out on any benefit from chemotherapy.
The Breast Cancer Foundation's Adele Gauthier says making the test more widely available means patients could avoid unnecessary chemotherapy.
Chemo has huge side effects. Just the obvious ones are losing your hair, infertility, dreadful pain in the hands and feet, the vomiting and so on, but also long-term effects that are really only being studied now in terms of cognitive function, ongoing pain, and for a small group of patients, heart disease, things like that.
Back in Auckland, Louise Kugler would like the test to be publicly funded.
If we hadn't made that choice, then I wouldn't have gone down the path of having chemotherapy, and my outcome could potentially have been quite different. So I think it would be fantastic for more women to have the choice, to have the right information based on the tests that are available out there.
The Ministry of Health says the results look interesting and it will consider the study's findings. For Checkpoint, Catherine Hutton.
Coming up, a dozen local and international companies pledged to make all of their packaging recyclable or compostable by 2025. Travel to rugby games, a cricket game, bars and dinner. How Manukau East MP Jenny Salesa spent more than the Prime Minister during her first 2 months in office. And Parliament gets a playground. We'd love your feedback. Don't forget you can text us on 2101 and you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Facebook us Checkpoint with John Campbell or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. But first, here's Katrina Batten with the headlines.
Forestry companies on the east coast are under pressure to ensure logging debris is properly managed after yesterday's flash flooding sent logs littering properties and clogging up rivers. The Gisborne District Council will investigate whether companies working in Tolaga Bay breached their resource consents. Residents say they were lucky they were not harmed and have been petitioning the council for years for stricter rules on logging slashings. The former National Prime Minister Jim Bolger is to head a government working group that will set up industry-wide employment negotiations. The plan is for fair pay agreements to be struck between unions and employers, setting minimum terms and conditions for all workers in an industry or occupation. The agreements would cover an entire sector, as was done for care and support workers under the former National-led government. The Ministry for the Environment will be monitoring a reduction in plastic waste promised by the major supermarket chains. The Countdown Group, as well as New World and Pack and Save, have today joined major international companies such as Coca-Cola and L'Oreal in a pledge to make all their packaging able to be recycled or composted within 7 years. The Southland Chamber of Commerce wants separate government policies for the regions so they can attract desperately needed skilled workers. It says attracting and retaining skilled staff is the biggest headache for Southland businesses. The Chamber says an Auckland-centric approach to immigration is hurting Southland and they want separate government policies for the regions. The Breast Cancer Foundation would like public funding for a test that means women in the early stages of the disease may not have to undergo chemotherapy. An American study says treatment determined by the genetic test has produced a similar survival rate between those who did and didn't have chemotherapy. The test costs at least $4,000. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Kia ora, Katrina. Well, turning to business news now with Nona Peltier. Nona, two telecoms companies, Vodafone and Vocus, they're promising a bigger, brighter broadband service when the national high-speed fibre network is deregulated in 18 months. What are they planning?
Well, they're planning to introduce some new technology which will make it not just faster. Say you're a gamer, you want really fast internet, faster than you can get now. So they'll be able to provide some additional hardware and other kinds of technology that will speed it up quite a lot. Also, they can do things like provide more broadband as you need it, as opposed to just a constant pipe of broadband. So there'll be differentiated services, which they'll be able to charge a premium price for. At the moment, it's just one size fits all, and the pricing is pretty much a kind of not competitive as such. You know, you're really choosing between one provider and another who can really, there's hardly any margin in it at the moment. So this will change the industry quite a lot. That's what Vocus and Vodafone are hoping. Vocus, in case people don't know, is really an Australian-owned operator that has two brands in New Zealand that provide broadband services. That's Slingshot and Orcon. So it'll be quite different.
Yeah, and so what will this be a bit of a shake-up for the market then?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of what we saw when they deregulated the copper lines, so that we had different kinds of services then. We're going to see this again now with the fibre network. So yeah.
And what do you expect, more competition when it comes to pricing?
Well, at this stage, this is the first group that we've heard are going to go into this. So we don't know what the other operators might consider, but they're going to offer these services as wholesale prices, so other retailers can offer them on. So we'll see perhaps a variety of services once this new technology is introduced. At the moment, really, we're looking at technology, according to Vodafone and Vocus, that was introduced in 2004. That's the standard that the current fibre network operates at. And since then, the standard has increased two times. So the latest standard is from 2015. So we're talking about a decade of catch-up. So we'll see what happens.
Right, so that's happening in 18 months' time.
Yeah, so from January 2020, when it's deregulated, that's when the services should be operating. In the meantime, those folks are going to have to do some negotiating with the current network operator. Primarily, that's Chorus.
Now, airline passengers, higher fares because of rising fuel prices, and airlines also facing rising labour costs and airport charges. How much more are we going to have to pay for our
Well,
airfares?
it's going to be substantial. I think that the airlines are talking about, well, they haven't actually come out and set a price, but we've already started to see some surcharges being introduced because of fuel charges. But we're going to see some additional charges coming in because of airport charges. And this is something that the airlines, especially in Australia and New Zealand, are working together to. They're targeting Auckland Airport specifically. Auckland Airport has raised their fees, and that's going to cost something like 61 cents per flight. So every passenger, 61 cents per flight into Auckland Airport over the next 5 years. That will result in Auckland Airport earning another $47 million. Now, those are fees that will be directly paid for by passengers. So that alone will tell you that there are some additional charges. The airlines, both in Australia and New Zealand, think that those charges are exorbitant and unjustified. And even the Commerce Commission has come out in a preliminary draft saying, well, sounds like you're making a bit too much money on your assets. However, they don't have any power at this stage to stop that from happening. So at this stage, all they can say is, we think that's too much. But the airport can still charge what they like.
But 61 cents per passenger doesn't sound like a lot.
It doesn't sound a lot, but it starts to add up if you think about it. And that's just that's only one airport, one charge. We're talking about fuel fees and labor costs. So there's a lot of other things that are in the mix there. And so it does add up, and we can expect to see higher fees. How much, we don't know, because competition will keep those prices down to some extent in any case. Yeah.
What's been happening on the markets today? Big day on the markets.
Yeah, big day on the markets. And at one point we touched the record, so that says something. Now, we were closed yesterday, one of the few markets in the world that was, for our Queen's birthday. Next week it's Australia's turn, so they were open. We're playing catch up, I guess, a little bit. We closed up 1.4%. That is a lot. That's 121 points to 8,757. So that's just off our record. And through the day, we actually hit the record, didn't go past it. But that's because we have changes to the global index that international investors look at. That's the MSCI NZ index. Now, what's going to happen is in a couple weeks, A2 Milk is going to move into that index and push mercury out. And so today, A2 Milk's price rose more than 5%. And another one of the large companies in New Zealand, Fisher & Paykel, rose more than 3%. And so that's what's driven that market higher. So our dollar, on the other hand, we've been steady. We moved up over the weekend to 70.2 US cents and 91.9 Australian, just flirting there with 92 cents, and 52.7 pence.
Excellent, Nona. Thanks very much for your time. That's Nona Peltier, our business reporter. The supermarket owners Foodstuffs and Countdown have joined with global giants Coca-Cola, Unilever and L'Oreal in committing to recycle and compost their packaging to help tackle plastic pollution. A dozen local and international companies today pledged to make all of their packaging recyclable or compostable by 2025, which they say will help create a circular economy and reduce waste. But as Nita Blake-Person reports, environmental groups have rubbished the pledge, which they say is too slow and doesn't go far enough.
It's estimated that a truckload of rubbish ends up in the ocean every minute, a grim statistic that's only expected to get worse. Coca-Cola, which uses 650 million plastic bottles in New Zealand each year, is among those companies that want to do better. Its spokesperson, Sarah Prestwood, was at a breakfast launch today to promote the pledge.
We want to ensure that, we have a key role to play along with other industry players in ensuring that there is reduced waste and that we have much cleaner oceans.
And Sarah Prestwood is standing by the timeline to use completely reusable, recyclable or compostable packaging in their New Zealand operations in the next 7 years.
I want to call it a delay because to pull off something like that is actually huge in its scale and its complexity.
Foodstuffs, which owns the Pack and Save New World and Foursquare brands, has also signed the declaration. Its procurement and development manager, Anthony Joseph, says the supermarket operator is focused on improving its own packaging as well as the products it buys from others.
When you're standing at a checkout this time next year with chips of cherry tomatoes and other things from our produce section, my commitment to you is that they will be made out of 100% recycled PET and that process will have happened right here in New Zealand.
But the company's pledge has been criticised by Greenpeace, as the group says just 14% of plastic is being recycled at the moment, and the key is reducing its use in the first place. And Paul Evans, the chief executive of the waste umbrella group Wastemin, says the government needs to hold the corporations to account.
That's where we need to move on from a voluntary commitment, and we actually have to have some regulation that supports this so that these companies are encouraged to use recycled material in their products, and actually they fund product stewardship schemes to ensure that these materials aren't only recyclable but they're also recycled.
The Conservation Minister Eugenie Sage says there will be some monitoring of the pledge.
Companies reporting to MFE and saying what they've done to make progress towards their goal by 2025.
What pressure then can MFE or what response can the government put on
I think when companies make this public commitment, it is up to those companies to live up to those commitments.
And Eugenie Sage says more change is on the way, including an increase on the levy used to fund waste minimisation initiatives such as recycling developments.
Government needs to provide leadership, which we're going to do by increasing the levy, by working with businesses to help progressive businesses set up more onshore processing plants, and reacting to initiatives like China's, which has sent us a real message. We need to do better with waste here in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
The government says an announcement about an increased waste levy is likely in the next few months. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blake-Person, aho.
The government was warned by officials its plan to curb future oil and gas exploration could have a chilling effect on investment if it wasn't handled well. Cabinet briefing papers and official communications about the decision to halt further offshore exploration permits have been released. The papers said if the supply of natural gas was restricted, that could push up consumer prices, pose a significant risk to security of energy supply, and have a detrimental impact on some regional economies. And they say global greenhouse gas emissions could rise if a restricted supply of natural gas pushes up prices, slowing local methanol production, which could then be replaced by methanol made from coal in China. The Energy Minister, Megan Woods, told our political editor, Jane Patterson, that was all taken into account.
Because those existing permits are being honoured, both the existing mining permits and the existing exploration permits. So in terms of the 2030 year horizon, nothing has changed in that respect. In terms of the technological change that will happen in that time, who knows what the future will look like.
So there are different scenarios in the briefing papers in relation to Methanex. What's your understanding about the short or medium term impact on Methanex because of the halt to offshore exploration permits?
Well, one of the things that I've visited Methanex, Minister Little's visited Methanex, and both Minister Little and the Prime Minister and I have all visited Methanex. And one of the things that we've given them assurances around is the fact that we will be honouring those existing permits. So in terms of the short and medium term, nothing changes because what existed before we made that announcement still exists today and will be honoured. And that's one of the things that we're working broadly across the industry to give those assurances about. The Prime Minister has offered to write to any international investors just to underscore and triple underscore the fact that we do intend to honour those permits. And if you contrast that with France, who have simply drawn a date when there will be no drilling past, New Zealand is doing this differently.
Why did you abandon the plan to have the Interim Climate Commission look into this and actually advise the full commission before making a future policy decision?
So this was something that we discussed quite deeply, and there were two reasons why we decided to not go down that path. One was the ability for the Interim Climate Committee to be able to do that work to advise the full commission. The second was that it just wasn't tenable for us to announce block off for 2018 with no offshore without giving a long-term signal to industry and to communities of what the future held. For us to be able to give the reassurances about honouring future permits, both mining and exploration, we couldn't simply kick this to touch. We needed to make a decision so that we could provide the long-term certainty in the context of change.
In the documents, there's a meeting arranged in February with oil and gas, and they're seeking some assurances about the future policy. Did you do enough industry consultation? And I know that the Crown Minerals Act only requires you to immediately consult iwi and or local authorities, but given the significance of this, why wasn't there more contact with the industry?
Oh, look, there was contact with the industry, and I did talk about the broad policy objectives of the government. And actually, the Prime Minister and myself, as early as November, were questioning whether or not there would be a block-offer process beyond 2017, and that signalled in documents that was released today. So this was very well signalled. The broad policy objectives were certainly discussed, but in the end, this is a commercial and confidential decision that couldn't be, the outcome couldn't be announced before it was announced.
But isn't consultation different from public statements by ministers, actually face-to-face meetings or engaged discussions with the people who will be affected or the industries that will be affected?
Look, discussions were had around the need to transition. I think one of the things that we're very clear on as a government is that a transition is just that. It is a transition. It has a different endpoint to the status quo. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we had the time to put in place the long-term planning so we could avoid shocks for industry, for communities and for individuals.
Why did it go through Cabinet as an oral item as opposed to a full Cabinet paper?
So this was something, the decision-making framework was something that I received advice on, and I think that's one of the sections of the documents that we've released today. That the established practice for taking block offer to Cabinet was through an oral item. In that oral item, I outlined the block that we would be taking out for consultation in 2018, and I think that's one of the important things that people need to realise is there actually is an active block offer out for consultation at the moment. It's onshore in Taranaki. We signalled in that oral item as well that there was to be no offshore and there wouldn't be future offshore offerings of acreage, and that there would be further papers coming to Cabinet around the implementation of that.
Aren't they two separate things though? I mean, you've got your block offer, and as you say, that could be done by an oral item, but the halting of future exploration permits apart from onshore Taranaki, it's a major policy change. Should it have been given its own specific consideration?
Look, this was a policy that was discussed at Cabinet through the oral item. It's also a policy that was very well discussed between the three parties that make up government. That the advice that I'd received was shared amongst all parties so that we could all go over that. So I'm confident that a good process was followed.
Megan Woods speaking to Jane Patterson about the dump of official oil and gas papers. Travel to rugby games, a cricket game, bars, dinner and what appears to be the gym. This is what contributed to the 16th ranked Minister Jenny Salesa outspending the Prime Minister in the first 2 months of the new government. You might remember this story from earlier this year. In March, Jenny Salesa refused to be interviewed about what she spent nearly $23,000 of taxpayer money on. So since then, we've been trying to get more information. Here's Zach Fleming with more.
The Rugby League World Cup, November last year. Tongan MP Jenny Salesa, the Minister for Building and Construction and Ethnic Communities, travelled to 3 games, paid for by the taxpayer. And many taxpayers I talked to today didn't think that's fair.
Obviously, no, that's not on, is it? Money should only be used for government-type related things, not rugby matches.
They shouldn't use it for granted. They should use it only reasonably, right? There's always networking going on between everyone, so yes.
Samoa vs Tonga on Saturday the 4th, just 1 week after she was sworn in as a new minister. Auckland to Hamilton and back. Tonga vs New Zealand a week later, again Saturday night, November the 11th. Again, Auckland to Hamilton and back. And then Tonga-England, again Saturday night, November the 25th, this time in Auckland though, and the taxpayer also paid for her to go to an event afterwards at Sky City. Ministers can use Crown limos at any time for any purpose, at their discretion, but...
The Minister would not want me to stand here and excuse it because she herself was hugely disappointed and is working to fix it.
That was Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's response back in March to Jenny Salesa racking up more than $30,000 of expenses in her first 2 months, more than anyone else in Parliament, including the Prime Minister herself. Miss Salesa, who as an MP and Cabinet Minister earns nearly $300,000 a year, also had the taxpayer pay for her travel to dinner with the Prime Minister in late November, a cricket game in December, travel to bars, the Wellington Club and Sweatshop Brew Kitchen, and what appears to be the gym, Discipline Performance in East Tamaki. She flew from Wellington to Auckland, then back down to Wellington and then back up to Auckland in one day. And one Saturday in January, she took a Crown limo from Auckland to Hamilton and back, but no addresses listed. It's the only entry in 5 months without one. Back in March, when the Prime Minister was apologising for her, Jenny Salesa refused to be interviewed, and her office actually contradicted the PM, defending her travel, saying it was within rules, despite this from Miss Ardern.
Do you know what? I would say that Minister Salesa herself isn't satisfied. In fact, she's made that clear to me.
But she didn't offer to pay any of her travel back, and Miss Salesa's office forced Checkpoint to go through the Official Information Act to get her travel and ministerial diaries. Her office released her travel diary, but refused to release her ministerial diary, and Miss Salesa has, again, refused to be interviewed about her travel, meaning we have no way of checking any of it.
She's undertaken to make sure it doesn't happen again, and I know she's hugely regretful.
That was the Prime Minister's third apology for a silent Miss Salesa back in March. Her travel costs have since been reined in. She spent less in 3 months this year than she did in 2 months last year, so clearly there were savings to be made. Miss Salesa declined repeated offers to be interviewed about her travel expenses. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
The inquiry into London's Grenfell Tower disaster has heard harrowing evidence about the advice given to residents to stay in their apartments when they should have been running for their lives. The fire service's stay put policy remained in place for nearly 2 hours as the blaze tore through the building. The inquiry has heard that was just one of a string of failures which led to the deaths of 71 people. The ABC's Nick Dole has more.
Few could forget the images of Grenfell Tower burning, but when firefighters received their first emergency call from the tower in June last year, they'd never have predicted the emergency would result in the deaths of 72 people. That call has now been released.
Fire brigade.
Yeah, hello, hi, in the fire, flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower, in the fridge.
Okay.
Quick.
They're on their
It's
way
burning.
already. Yes, I know it's burning, but they are on their way.
When fire crews arrived, they implemented a so-called stay put policy, advising residents to remain inside their apartments while they contained the fire. An expert report released by the inquiry has found that strategy essentially failed. Once the fire started spreading, the building should have been evacuated, but it took nearly 2 hours for authorities to change their policy. It's a delay that's angered many residents like Shaheen Sadafi.
It's clear to see that the building is done. It's clearly spreading fast. The fire is uncontrollable. People need to get out. We have to ask a tough question. Why was it that the stay put policy was not changed?
The inquiries heard firefighters hadn't anticipated the fire's rapid spread. It was fuelled in part by combustible cladding that had been fitted to the building's exterior. According to expert evidence, combustible material was also used around the windows and kitchen vents. But that's not all that went wrong. Fire doors failed and many didn't meet regulations. The building's fire rescue lift didn't work, and its water supply for the firefighters failed too. The smoke ventilation system didn't do its job either, so residents were reluctant to evacuate because it was so hard to see and breathe. Counsel to the inquiry, Richard Millett QC, says while much of the evidence is technical, it's all aimed at answering a fundamental question.
How, in London, in 2017, a domestic fire developed so quickly and so catastrophically that an entire high-rise block was engulfed?
Experts say the fire was probably started by a faulty fridge on the 4th floor. The real question, though, is why the blaze couldn't be stopped.
And that was Nick Dole in London. A playground is going to be built on the front lawn of Parliament in spring as part of a bid to make the place more family friendly. There'll be a slide, a tunnel, some stepping stones and a maze built on the smaller lawn directly in front of the beehive. The Speaker of the House, Trevor Mallard, is behind the idea, and he told our Deputy Political Editor Chris Bramwell that it's part of a plan to demystify Parliament and make it less stuffy.
I think it's important to make Parliament more open and to encourage people to come to it. And what I'm hoping is that people will flow from the playground into the buildings on the tours, and Parliament will be demystified a bit.
Can you give a picture of what you think the playground will look like, what your plan is?
The plan has been based on having a sort of a minimal disruption to the view of Parliament. So we don't want big sort of red, yellow and blue slides and playground equipment. It involves a slide, it involves natural materials, it's got a tunnel, it's got a maze, it's got some stepping stones, and it's got some seats for people who are supervising the kids to sit down and to watch them. So it's not a big playground, and you won't see much of it from a distance away.
In terms of when it might be built and when kids will be able to come and play on it, when's that going to happen?
We're going to go out to tender now. Building time is likely to be in the late spring or summer in order to get the right conditions and not to make too much of a mess of the rest of the lawn while it's happening.
And that was Parliament Speaker Trevor Mallard. The US Supreme Court has ruled in favour of a Christian baker in Colorado who refused to custom make a wedding cake for a gay couple. The decision comes 6 years after the couple launched legal action after the baker refused to make the cake. Colette Luke from Reuters explains.
Colorado baker Jack Phillips, who was sued for refusing to make a wedding cake for a gay couple on religious grounds, was handed a victory by the Supreme Court on Monday. In a 7-2 decision, the justices said the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which represented the gay couple David Mullins and Charlie Craig, had violated Phillips' religious rights under the First Amendment. The commission had argued Phillips violated Colorado's anti-discrimination laws, which bar businesses from refusing service based on race, sex, marital status, or sexual orientation. In 2012, Mullins and Craig visited Phillips' bakery, Masterpiece Cake Shop, in Lakewood, Colorado. The two were getting married in Massachusetts, but were looking for a wedding cake for a local reception. But Phillips refused to make the cake, saying it would be at odds with his religious beliefs.
I respectfully declined to create a custom cake that would celebrate a view of marriage in direct conflict with my faith's core teachings.
We were mortified and humiliated, and we felt like second-class citizens in our society.
Two of the court's 4 liberals, Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, joined the 5 conservative justices in the ruling. Although Phillips won a big victory in a case that pitted gay rights against religious freedom claims, the High Court did not give a definitive ruling on whether other people can seek exemptions from anti-discrimination laws based on their religious views.
That is not freedom.
And that was Colette Luke from Reuters. Coming up after 6 tonight, the forest debris known as slash, how Tolaga Bay locals say they were lucky to escape unharmed as more than 200 millimetres of rain fell in just 24 hours, sending a torrent of debris through properties, clogging up rivers and destroying business. We'll talk to the Environmental Services Director at the Gisborne District Council about that. And we're at Government House as recipients described as brave and courageous receive the Royal Humane Society of New Zealand's Silver Medal.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening. Ko Katrina Batten aho. The Gisborne District Council says it will investigate how so much logging debris was left strewn over properties, roads and in rivers after flash flooding in Tolaga Bay yesterday morning. Local residents say they've been warning for years about the mismanagement of forestry slash and say they were lucky to escape unharmed as a torrent of debris blasted through properties. Anusha Bradley reports.
The council says the debris is likely to have come from 2 logging companies in the area and it will be investigating whether resource consents have been breached. One of the companies logging in the area, Hikurangi Forest Farm, says it's puzzled at how much debris was washed away. Its general manager Ian Brown says it's taken steps to reduce the amount of slash in recent years. An online petition set up last night calling for stricter controls on forestry debris in the Gisborne area has collected nearly 1,000 signatures. Ko Anusha Bradley aho.
The former National Party Prime Minister Jim Bolger is to lead a government-appointed panel setting up industry-wide collective negotiations. The plan is to set up fair paid agreements to be struck between unions and employers, setting minimum terms and conditions of employment for all workers in an entire industry or occupation. Mr Bolger will head the 10-person panel made up of representatives from business, unions, academia, hospitality and sport. He says he decided to take part because there's a sense out there the world is no longer fair.
That some have made obscene wealth and some are missing out just about altogether. We try to look after the bottom by minimum wage rates, but it's the middle that seems to be almost forgotten. And I think what we have to do and what the panel will try to do, 10 good people, is find some answers in this space.
Jim Bolger. The Southland Chamber of Commerce is calling for a regional immigration plan to combat severe shortfalls in skilled workers. The Chamber's president, Neil Makara, says attracting and retaining skilled staff has been the biggest headache for Southland businesses for several years. Timothy Brown reports.
Unemployment in Southland currently sits at 2.7%. But the labour market is squeezed and employers in the region are crying out for skilled workers. Adding to the problem is what the president of the Southland Chamber of Commerce sees as an Auckland-centric approach to immigration policy. Neil Makara says a regional plan is necessary to address the increasingly dire situation facing businesses in the regions. He says Auckland needs a separate plan to combat the massive influxes it faces, but he warns reacting to Auckland's problems with nationwide policies is hurting regions like Southland. This is Timothy Brown.
A woman who paid thousands for a test after being diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer says it should be publicly funded in New Zealand. An American study has found treatment determined by the genetic test produced a similar survival rate for those who did and didn't have chemotherapy. In April last year, Aucklander Louise Kugler was diagnosed with an early-stage slow-growing breast cancer. Based on the diagnosis, her oncologist recommended a treatment plan which included hormone and radiotherapy, but not chemotherapy. But her decision to spend $6,000 on the test, which involved sending her tissue samples to the United States, may have saved her life.
The test came back with a surprisingly different result than what was expected, which was that it was actually a high-risk breast cancer. So based on that information, my oncologist then changed my treatment plan and included chemotherapy alongside the other treatment as well.
Breast cancer survivor Louise Kugler. The Prime Minister will speak to media as she leaves hospital after her baby is born. Jacinda Ardern's office has released details of arrangements for the birth, which is due in 12 days' time. Jessie Chang reports.
Winston Peters will assume his acting Prime Minister responsibilities when Jacinda Ardern arrives at hospital to have the baby. She plans to give birth at Auckland Hospital, but there are contingency plans if she's not in Auckland. She has already said she will work up until she goes into labour. Ms Ardern and her partner Clark Gayford will pose for photos and answer questions when they leave the hospital after the birth. However, they've asked that the media respect the family's privacy while Ms Ardern is on parental leave. She is the second world leader to give birth while in office. Kōjisi Chang Tierney.
It's 6:04. Sport. 2 New Zealand golfers have qualified for the second major of the year, the US Open in New York next week. Manawatu golfer Tim Wilkinson made the field after finishing second in a qualifying tournament in Washington, helped by a hole-in-one. It's a major boost for Wilkinson, who lost his PGA Tour card for this year. He joins Aucklander Ryan Fox, who's also made the US Open field after qualifying at a tournament in England. The Open tees off on Thursday week at the Shinnecock Hills course in New York. The All Whites coach Fran Schmid believes match fitness could be a factor when his team meet Chinese Taipei in their second game at the Intercontinental Cup in Mumbai tonight. The New Zealanders lost 2-1 to Kenya in their opening match of the Four-Nation tournament at the weekend. Hot monsoon-like conditions are expected again, and Schmid says that will make things tough.
We might have to be aware of certain players getting to the limit in terms of fitness and pace.
India are unbeaten at the tournament after beating Kenya in their second game. Salford have released former Kiwis Rugby League international Manu Vatuvei with 5 months remaining on his Super League contract. Vatuvei joined the Red Devils in July and played in the last 8 matches of their 2017 campaign, but severely damaged his Achilles tendon in a freak training accident a week before the opening match of the 2018 season. He was contracted to the end of the year, but has now agreed to an early release. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Nick Bollinger's sampling an eclectic mix of new music, from Diva Mahal to Mr. Sterile, who sounds anything but. There's Global Delights from Trevor Riki after 11, and Eric Brenstrom from Met Service reports on global atmospheric conditions. We'll also have a story about the decisive role the weather played during the D-Day landings 74 years ago this week.
And between 10 and 11 p.m, join me, Karen Hay, for Lately. We'll be focusing on the events of the day, both nationally and internationally, and talking to the newsmakers in an eclectic mix that covers everything from the arts to politics to live events. That's Lately with Karen Hay in the 10 p.m. hour, weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, occasional showers, some heavy from tomorrow afternoon with possible thunderstorms and hail. Waikato to Kapiti, including the Central High Country, mostly fine today. Showers tomorrow, some heavy with hail, and snow to 600 metres about the Central High Country. Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Scattered rain clearing today. Showers from tomorrow afternoon, some heavy with hail, and snow to 600 metres about Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Wellington and Wairarapa, isolated showers today. Showers becoming widespread tomorrow with hail and snow above 600 metres. Nelson, Buller and Westland fine, apart from a few showers tonight or early tomorrow. Marlborough and Canterbury, cold southerlies developing tonight with showers. Snow to 200 metres tomorrow morning, then easing later. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, occasional rain or showers with possible thunderstorms about the south coast today. Snow to 200 metres tonight and tomorrow morning. The Chatham Islands, a period of heavy rain and thunderstorms tonight, then showers tomorrow. It's 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Kia ora Katrina, I'm Sharon Brett Kelly in for John Campbell. The Gisborne District Council says it is investigating how so much logging debris was washed downstream after flash flooding hit the Tolaga Bay area yesterday morning. Local residents say they've been raising concerns for years about the mismanagement of forestry slash and say they were lucky to escape unharmed as more than 200 millimetres of rain fell in just 24 hours, sending a torrent of debris through properties, clogging up rivers and destroying businesses. The Environmental Services Director at the Gisborne District Council, Nick Zaman, says the debris has come from 2 logging companies in the area. I asked him to describe the devastation.
I haven't been up there personally. I've got a flight arranged tomorrow to actually go through, but some of my team have been out and I've actually seen the drone footage and have actually seen the extent of the it is really devastating in terms of some of the areas.
What does it look like? How bad is it?
There is significant amount, we're talking millions of tons of woody debris in areas strewn across the place. So it is very significant in terms of our infrastructure, block passes, bridges, and other areas.
Is it worse than Bowler 30 years ago?
No, I wouldn't. I wasn't here 30 years ago, but I wouldn't say it is as bad as that. But it is significant, and the last big event that we had was Cook.
And who's responsible for this? I mean, the forestry companies, should they take some blame for the volume of the slash and logs?
I think it's important to understand, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment, the volume, the amount of rain that we actually had yesterday. In some places, we had 266 millimetres, particularly around the area where there's lots of slash, in a 24-hour period. So at the moment, we are investigating in terms of whether it is due to actual forestry practices, but also the land slips that might have occurred and would very much likely have occurred given the amount of volume of rain we've had.
Have you been in contact with the forestry companies? Who are they?
There are a number of forestry companies involved. In those two forestries that are affected the most are Hikarangi Forest and PF Olsen. And a team have been in contact with those forestries as part of the wider response.
And will they be part of the clean-up?
Certainly hoping that they will be part of the clean-up. At the moment, our focus at the moment is to make sure things are safe for people using the roads, that we're clearing that, assessing the damage to infrastructure and what work needs to happen at the moment. But at the moment, it's really about opening up those roads, those major pathways in and out, and making sure people are safe.
What sort of damage has it caused?
As I said, that at the moment we're actually assessing what damage, and there have been a significant number of bridges and other areas that infrastructure has been affected, and it will take us some weeks to actually assess those, but the main priority is to actually move the material and get that those pathways, those corridors open and running again.
But we understand from farmers who have been on RNZ earlier today that this is an ongoing issue with the amount of forestry that's going on there, with the slash and the logs, and that one farmer called it a hot potato. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of that, and it is certainly devastating, and particularly those who are affected and those in the community. And we have been working with the forestry industry in terms of improving practice, and also through our freshwater plan, we've made things a lot more stringent in terms of what is actually required and what is going to be required to be done in the future.
And are these forestry companies going by those rules? I mean, have you had cooperation from them?
We have had cooperation. We are working with them. It is very much, a change and bringing the forestry industry along in terms of educating them. And we are at the moment and have been working through our consent and what we're required to do now. So the National Environmental Standards for Plantation Forestry has come in and central government has set that. But we're looking at we have got more stringent rules, and it's about bringing those in and making sure that the practices are adhered to.
Nick, have they breached their consent here, or is that too soon to say?
As I said, it's really too soon to say. We'll be up. We'll be flying over the affected areas. We have done quite a bit of work in assessing those areas post-Cook. So it'll be having a very good look at what's actually happened. And as I said, it's very much likely to be a combination of both practices, but just the sheer volume of rain that we've had and land slips, which are very, very common. It could be a mixture of wood that has been there in the past that has been settled, or it could be due to harvests that have gone on, and we will be looking at, and that's what we're investigating over the next couple of weeks.
Are you surprised no one's been injured?
I think we can thank our lucky stars, really. It's just amazing, and we're really grateful that no one has been injured.
A lot of damage though, and farmers are saying that they're the locals who have to bear the brunt of it. A lot of damage to their farms, to fences, as you say, to bridges, and yet these forestry companies are either offshore companies or based in the city who, are removed from the day-to-day situation and the damage that it's caused.
I think it's important to put this in a bit of context. Forestry is a very big part of the sector up here as well. And so, it does have a future here in the Gisborne region. And it's very difficult, that balance between ensuring that the sector, what it does and how it moves forward in the future is sustainable, and also with the developing economy. So it is important. And it's striking that balance with both the communities and the farmers and the forestry, and working through what that looks like in the future and how that works.
Environmental Services Director at the Gisborne District Council, Nick Zaman. Some tourism operators in the Abel Tasman National Park say a hike in fees for huts and campsites will put some overseas visitors off. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The government plans to make foreign tourists pay twice as much as locals to stay in tramping huts on 4 of the country's great walks, including the Abel Tasman track. From October, overseas visitors wanting to stay in any Department of Conservation huts in the Abel Tasman will need to fork out $75 a night. On the Milford track, they'll pay $140 for a night in a hut. Here's our Nelson reporter Tracy Neal with the story.
Every day throughout summer, thousands of visitors line up to board a boat into the Abel Tasman National Park. Others hike in from the entry point at Maraho. The country's smallest national park now attracts about 300,000 visitors a year, and 60% of them are from overseas. Daryl Wilson runs a large tourism operation there and says the plan to increase fees for overseas tourists at dock sites is not altogether a bad thing, even if it puts some off visiting.
Well, this is a trial of charging for what has historically been subsidised accommodation within national parks. I think as a country it's timely and probably overdue that we reassess that.
Conservation Minister Eugenie Sage announced the increase while she was in the Abel Tasman during Queen's birthday weekend. The 7-month trial will test whether increased fees will ease visitor pressure on the 9 great walks around the country. But Daryl Wilson believes it's a commercial decision on DOC's part.
The Abel Tasman's managed. It's got quotas for day visitors through the commercial operators. It's got a finite set of campsites and hut sites, so there is no expectation in my mind that the Department of Conservation is expecting numbers to reduce. What they're expecting is to get a realistic revenue stream from those that are using some of their assets.
Mr Wilson says in the past it's been commercial operators who've had to wear the cost increases through hikes in the concessions and levies they pay. He says it's only right that DOC moves to a fairer user pays model. Other operators agree but reckon a tax at the border would be fairer. Robert Kay owns a batch with his wife in one of the Abel Tasman's few private enclaves.
Rather than differentiate between the tourists and the Kiwis, they should have just equalised it and charged an additional fee and made it equitable right across the board.
Mr Kay has been a regular visitor to the park since the 1950s. He says tourists from abroad should be prepared to pay their share of maintenance costs.
I certainly haven't got anything against them, but what I feel is that tourism should pay equitably to maintain these facilities, just as we do when we go to other countries.
Daryl Wilson says user pays fees and charges are common around the world. An annual pass to the Yosemite National Park in California's Sierra Nevada mountains is $70. A mountain hut fee on the Appalachian Trail can cost up to $140 a night, but that includes dinner and breakfast. German tourist Max Michel, who was on his way to the Abel Tasman National Park today, says he wouldn't pay $75 to stay in a hut there.
Yeah, that's quite a lot actually. I mean, if I think about it, we're already that broke at the moment that we need to take care of not driving too much. So because the fuel price has exploded in the last 2 weeks.
And what about buying food here? Do you find that really pricey?
Well, in comparison to Germany, it is.
The Department of Conservation expects to bring in an extra $3 million during the trial period. And kids can rest easy. All of the Great Walks will remain free of charge for New Zealand children. In Nelson for Checkpoint, Tracy Neal.
Brave, courageous and exceptional, just a few of the words used by Governor-General Dame Patsy Reddy to describe recipients of the Royal Humane Society of New Zealand's Silver Medal. One man wrestled a knife off a murderer, another saved a man from a sinking car, and a team of 3 worked for 17 hours straight to save passengers from a plane that crashed in a remote part of Nepal. They're just 5 of the 10 who were awarded the medal at a ceremony this afternoon at Government House in Wellington. Emma Hatton went to meet them.
Since 1898, the Royal Humane Society has recognised 2,300 people who have acted courageously in the face of danger. Today, 10 more were added to that tally.
Mr. Parky put his life at serious risk.
Auckland painter Zane Parky is one of them. He was working in a building on Queen Street in May 2015 when Mandeep Singh stabbed his wife, Pamita Rani, to death, then turned on her friend. Mr. Parky says he didn't know a woman had already been killed when he took the knife off the attacker.
When I took the knife off him and he turned around and faced me, she was on the ground dead, you know. And then I went, oh, my heart just went, I was like, oh, it's just gone from attempted murder to a murder and attempted murder, you know. If I would have seen that first, I probably would have did it differently. I probably would have just picked up my ladder and just smacked him on the head and then just knocked him out.
He says at the time the idea that he could be hurt or even killed didn't cross his mind.
My wife, you know, she's like, did you ever think about us or the kids when you went and done that? And I was like, no, I didn't actually, I just went and done it, you know. At the time, adrenaline, just wanted to go and do what you had to do, what was in front of you, and I done it, so I'd do it again if I had to.
Mandeep Singh is now serving life in jail with a minimum non-parole period of 13 years for murder and attempted murder. Another recipient is Rory Clark, who along with his friend Oliver Beaumont swam elderly man Bruce Imrie back to shore after his car ended up in a Christchurch estuary in March last year. Unfortunately, Mr Imrie's wife Maureen, who was also in the car, couldn't be saved.
Just as I got there, the car went down with Bruce and with Ollie. And I went down after the car as far as I could go and couldn't see a thing, and I came up and waited what felt like an eternity, and then Ollie and Bruce came up. Unfortunately, Maureen didn't.
Rescue team Andrew Gutzel, Alyssa Lowe and Andrew Roy were recognised for their bravery after a dramatic plane salvage mission in Nepal. In May last year, a cargo plane crashed near Tenzing Hillary Airport. The pilot, Andrew Gutzel, says for 17 hours straight the trio administered first aid, helped patients get to hospital and kept the 400-strong crowd of survivors and civilians under control.
It was a bit of a saga. A lot happened in kind of the 17 hours that we were working on that incident. There was a lot of crowd control, a lot of mitigation of risk for the local people that were swarming around the wreckage. There was a lot of triaging the patients who were on board the aircraft.
But he says it's just all part of the job and he'll be back monitoring the valleys around Mount Everest soon.
I'll be back definitely spring over the high altitude climbing season in the valley, and potentially autumn as well when the trekking's going on to base camp.
Other award winners include Grant Wooding, who rescued a man out of a burning car in Geraldine 2 years ago. Policemen Billy Ray Slight and Aaron Wilkins, who saved a man from the swollen Hutt River. And Nan Xia and Juan Shang, who saved a woman who was stuck in a sinking car. At Government House for Checkpoint, Emma Hatton.
A teenager in London who became the youngest female in the country to be charged with terror offences has been convicted of planning a major terror attack. Safar Bula was 16 when she was first investigated by the police. The 18-year-old is part of an all-woman family terror cell linked to Islamic State, which had planned 2 separate attacks in the British capital. The BBC's June Kelly has the details.
This was when armed officers moved in on the UK's first all-female terror cell, firing CS gas canisters into a flat in northwest London. In the mayhem, one of the women, Ghislaine Boulard, was shot by police. She'd been hours away from causing carnage on the streets of London. Also detained was her mother, Mina Dish. Her younger sister, Safa, had already been arrested for planning her own separate attack.
We believe that they were going to attack members of the public at random, using knives with a view to inflicting injury or certainly killing individuals. So we intervened at an early stage with a view to frustrating that terrorist plot.
All three went on to embrace violent extremism, and by the age of 16, Safa Boulard was trying to marry an IS fighter in Syria. She'd never met Naveed Hussein. Theirs was an online relationship. When he was killed, she was distraught. The couple had talked about how Safa Boulard could carry out an attack in the area around the British Museum in central London. They discussed an ambush involving guns or grenades and using a car and a knife. Safa Boulard was arrested, but she then encouraged her sister to carry out her own attack. In court, Safa Boulard wore Western clothing, and during her trial she said she'd now rejected Islamist extremism. The jury heard a recording of a phone call she made from prison to her sister, who was on the outside. During that conversation, her sister Ghislaine spoke of her plans to hold a Mad Hatter's Tea Party, which the prosecution said was code for a terror attack.
It's going to be on Thursday. We're going to have the party. This Thursday? Yeah. You serious? Yeah.
The following evening, Ghislaine was being driven around Westminster by their mother, scouting targets. Mother and daughter then went on a shopping trip to Sainsbury's to buy knives for their attack. It was the daughter, Ghislaine, who was going to be the killer. The women were arrested the next day. Zach Tai was at school with Ghislaine Boulard.
Ghislaine was a very outgoing person. She was lovely to talk to all the time, always smiling, very intelligent, I would say, and all around just a regular teenager. It's just strange to hear that in her adulthood she became such a monster, I guess.
She and her mother, Mina Dish, had already pleaded guilty to terrorism charges. Today, her sister Safa, the youngest member of this family terror cell, was convicted by a jury. All three women will be sentenced later.
June Kelly with that report. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has stirred controversy after he asked a woman to kiss him on the lips on stage in exchange for a book during an official visit to South Korea. Women's rights groups have condemned the event, saying it was part of a bigger effort to deflect from real policy issues and Mr Duterte's waning popularity. Harovi Cooper from Reuters reports.
It was a high-level meeting between Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte and South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in. But it's this moment that stole the headlines at the political summit. Duterte kissing a Filipino worker at a rally in Seoul caught on live television. Feminists slamming the kiss as a gimmick to entertain supporters.
And the fact that you thought that kissing the woman would entertain people still says something about how you view women. Women are for entertainment, that you can express or exercise your authority over another person, especially a woman, is entertainment. That's something really sick.
But many Filipinos at home thought the incident was completely harmless.
For me, that kiss was okay, as long as the woman was okay with it. It seems like she was the one who even requested it. People are just putting malice to it, but it was just a simple kiss.
The kiss that lit up Twitter with jokes and anger took place on Sunday night in front of a cheering crowd of over 3,000 people when Duterte asked an unidentified audience member to kiss him in exchange for a book he was handing out. In a later interview, the woman identified as Bia Kim said the kiss did not mean anything to her and there was no malice. But critics say even if the act was consensual, it was a grave abuse of authority, especially since Duterte has a history of making sexist remarks, including numerous jokes about rape.
And that was Hirovi Cooper from Reuters with that report. Before we go, some feedback on our story about the 16th ranked Minister Jenny Salesa outspending the Prime Minister in the first 2 months of the new government and what the money was spent on. One texter says, the story about the Minister's expenses makes me sick. If a beneficiary earns a cent over their entitlement, they are slammed against a wall. It's not good enough. And Greg wrote in response to the story about fee hikes for overseas tourists and some of the Great Walks, tourists like the German who was broke are tourists we definitely do not want. Well, that's Checkpoint for this evening. Thanks for joining us on your radio, your television, online, or however you choose to connect with us today. You can catch up on our stories tonight on at rnz.co.nz/checkpoint or on our Facebook page. And for all the latest news, information, feature stories from New Zealand and around the world, go to the rnz.co.nz homepage. So from me, Sharon Brett Kelly, and the Checkpoint team, have a great night.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Tolaga Bay residents are pressing for stricter rules on forestry management after flash floods sent logs careering down waterways and onto their properties. Jim Bolger will head a 10-person panel charged with creating fair pay agreements to set minimum terms and conditions for all workers in an industry or occupation. The government will monitor a pledge by the major supermarket chains to reduce plastic waste by making all their packaging recyclable or compostable within 7 years. Southland's Chamber of Commerce is calling for a regional approach to immigration so employers there can access desperately needed skilled workers. And the Prime Minister will hand over to her deputy when she arrives at hospital for the birth of her baby, due in 12 days' time. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Worlds of Music is a world music program with a difference. Every week